Welcome back to How to Be a Better DM, the official podcast of Monsters.rent. I'm Justin Lewis.
And I'm Tanner Wayland.
And we are here to help you tell better stories for yourself and your players as you dungeon master sessions of D&D, Dungeons & Dragons. We'd like to give you some quick announcements. We actually have one before the show, and then after the show, if you want to stick around, we have some more announcements then as well. But first, let's talk about this. Tired of being alone? Are you tired of not having any of your players understand you? Are you tired of never truly belonging? Well, you're in luck. All you need to do is join the Guild. The Guild is a unique and exclusive experience that is only open to Dungeon Masters. It is a full community focused on helping ease your DMing burdens. Want to meet other DMs? Join the Guild. Want to discuss your homebrew ideas with people who would appreciate it instead of just telling your cat? Join the Guild. Want to find a place where all your wildest dreams will come true? Join the Guild. Go to monsters.rent/guild and sign up today for free. Wait, that can't be right. Chuck, can you check this again? Is this supposed to be... What? Oh, they're serious? It's free? Oh, okay. All right. Yes, go to monsters.rent/guild and sign up today for free, even though they are crazy for giving this away for free. Common side effects may include burping, sneezing, laughing, breathing, hearing, listening, tasting, farting, critting, sarcasm, and in extreme cases, explosive diarrhea. Awesome. With that out of the way, we can get into today's show. Welcome back to How to Be a Better DM. I am here, your co-host, Justin Lewis, with my co-host, Tanner Wayland. And before we get into anything else, let's dive right in with the warm-up for today's episode. So, Tanner, I want you to... Today we're going to be talking about character creation. So, I want you to pick a bond, a flaw, a personality trait, and an ideal for a hypothetical Tiefling artificer named Troaxiaus.
Okay, so Troaxiaus, right? Am I saying that right? Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, so Troaxiaus's bond is it's actually his uncle. It is his uncle Lysander. Let's go with the classic name. Who actually helped him get into artificing. Specifically, his uncle was into that as well, and he gave young Troaxiaus a little mechanical bird that actually kind of, like, you could wind it and it would hop around, and that kind of got his interest into all things kind of like tinkering, like figuring out how things work and building things, and so that's his bond, his uncle, and he kind of has that physical representation through that little kind of steampunk mechanical bird. His flaw is that he gets upset when people don't give him permission. Specifically, like, he's pleasant enough when you're doing something he doesn't care about or something he wants, but if it's something that he's not a fan of, he'll say it straight to you, and he's not going to be pleasant or like cut corners or anything. He's a little bit socially stunted that way.
Right, so he's kind of blunt, is what you're saying.
Blunt, and also maybe a little unaware of how you ought to say those kind of things. Gotcha. His personality trait is, I would just say, boundless curiosity. He is just into finding out how everything works, why people think the way they do, which also plays into his, artificing kind of role. Like, I picture him as someone who, as everybody's talking, he's over at the clock, like the family's heirloom clock, disassembling it. And then suddenly the family gets mad, and he's like, "What do you have against me?" Yeah. And then for the ideal, his goal is to build something that the whole world can just marvel at and come to see. He doesn't know what it is yet, but he wants something that In the same way he's fascinated by basically everything, everyone will come from, all over to look at whatever it is in the town square, right? So that's kind of his ideal.
Wow. That is such a cool character. I imagined him, they go to a family's house to get some information or whatever. Everyone's talking with the family like you described. He's taking apart the clock, and then they have to leave, so he just leaves without putting it back together, and they're like, what? And he's like, sorry, I gotta go. And it's just like this clock. I think that was a very excellent character. So well done, Tanner. Thank you, listener, for thank you, listener, for joining us again on How to Be a Better DM. I'm here with my cohort, Tanner Wayland, who has, as you heard, he is an expert dungeon master and character creationist. Is that the right term, Tanner?
Sure, we'll call it that.
Well, as you heard today, we are talking about character creation. More importantly, how to explain character creation to your players. But before we get into that, as always, we have a couple of housekeeping items. We gotta, sweep the floor of the tavern as it will. First of all, we are planning and preparing for our one-shot coming up in September. We still have not released the date of that, so if you are interested, make sure to click the link in the show notes because spots are filling up. I think we have either 2 or 3 spots filled up, and Tanner actually will be the dungeon master. So, Tanner, do you have any idea on how many players you're looking to have in this one-shot?
Yeah, I think this one I'm going to go for more than I typically do. I am shooting for about 5 players at this point.
Perfect. And like I said, we will reveal the dates for that as soon as we pick them out. Second kind of announcement is we've toyed around with the idea of doing live shows and having kind of the ability for you as a listener to join in and be present while we record these episodes and, ask questions and kind of give back in the chat, as it were. So if you're interested in that, reach out to us on Instagram at howtobea.betterdm and let us know if that's something you're interested in. If it is, we can easily let the URL for attending these episodes be available, and you can watch and participate and hopefully help us create better content and answer some questions that are, just plaguing the minds of thousands. But any other announcements you have, Tanner?
No, honestly, that covered everything.
Sure. Oh, and also, we haven't done this in a while, but is there anything particularly that you're kind of nerding out about or you're just super psyched about?
Well, I just got a new laptop.
Ooh.
Yes. And I'll just come out and say, I think I told you this before. I've been interested in, game development in terms of like video games and stuff, because some of my siblings have expressed interest in that as well recently. And so, that's what I'm kind of working on right now. And it's very fascinating. Gives me something that I'm just interested in learning in addition to, everything else. So it's me putting another thing on my plate, just like I definitely didn't need, but I'm excited.
I hear that. It's like you're all like, about 3 months ago, I was like, that's it. No more extra opportunities or extra things. And then like the night after, my friend was like, hey, you want to join us in this Star Wars RPG? And I was like,
classic.
Oh, crap. I didn't end up joining, but this just goes to show you whenever you're like, I have enough on my plate, something else comes up. But let's get on to today's topic, which is character creation explained simply, plus maybe some extra tools that you can use in helping your players create the best characters. So first thing to say before we kind of really get into this is just the goal of today's show isn't to explain to you how to create characters, because obviously you're a dungeon master. You know how to do that. And plus, that's obviously defined in the player's handbook. Today's goal, actually, is to attempt to help you simplify the process for your players. So it's essentially to help you help the noobiest of noobs start to play D&D. And that starts with character creation. And so we're going to kind of describe the different processes simply and then maybe give some tips or tools for helping you explain and work through that process with your players. And as you notice, the order we describe these is the same order described in D&D Beyond, though you can do it in different ways, and we might recommend doing it in different ways. But let me also stress something else. Making the character and helping your players make the character and doing that process as an easy and fun activity is important, because if your player does not get past character creation, they're never going to play. Anything else you want to add before we start, Tanner?
Well, the only thing I would add is that character creation should be, for new players, it should be just such a treat. Because if you leave it for them on their own, unless they're kind of how I was when I started out, where I was like, I'm the kind of person who, when I get interested in something, I'll just binge all of the info that's on that, right? I know other people who aren't like that, especially if it's someone who's like kind of a little anxious, a little nervous about joining, and they're doing it because they're trying something new. Or someone, who frankly didn't want to, and you finally convinced to be able to play. You need to make the character creation process almost as fun as the actual game itself, so that they can actually get into it. And so explaining each of these different aspects of character creation in a way that's simple but also enjoyable and lets their imagination run wild, that's kind of what we want to focus on. Yeah. Agreed.
Well, let's get right in with the first step, which is choosing your race.
Yeah, let's go. So with race, I had a few thoughts on this. Obviously, race in real world things is kind of a sticking subject throughout all of history ever. And the good news is, and also the interesting news with D&D, is that you can choose how much of a role race plays, right? Because functionally in character creation, they typically give you some bonuses. Maybe like it'll determine how like the size of your character's mini, right? But essentially that's like they can choose that, and I think more experienced players, some of them might think more on the line of like, oh, what kind of class am I building? Okay, let's get me something. Oh, I'm going to be a rogue. Let's look for something that's got the stats that I want, right? But like some extra dexterity, things like that. However, I'm just going to say this right now. You as the DM actually have the biggest, the biggest role for how much race plays a role in your campaign, right? Because players, I've found that they kind of fall into a few different camps, but the most prevalent are, one, they just kind of take the Tolkien-esque / typical fantasy stereotypes, and they just run with it, right? If they're a dwarf, they'll be like, oh, I'm a dwarf, and I like, hammers and all this stuff, and mining and beer, and they're just kind of stereotypical. Same for hobbits or halflings, I guess, right? And elves and everything else, and orcs, especially orcs, right? If anyone ever tries to play that, they're gonna go immediately to that. So it's either people just kind of embracing that comfortable stereotype, or they kind of disregard it and they'll just play however they want, essentially treating the race as just a random kind of negligible factor in how they play the character. And they'll just, in a way, that's great too, because you're not just making your entire character around stereotype. But there's nothing also wrong, especially for a new player, if they're like, oh, I want to be a dwarfy dwarf. There's nothing wrong, especially if they're playing the first time. Who are you to say, oh, that lacks a lot of nuance, but okay. It just doesn't make sense to do that. However, some players, if they really are interested in that idea, or if your campaign that you're making, like a race plays a key component, it's kind of on you to let your players know that, right? If you're like, hey, I'm doing dwarfs a bit differently, or I'm doing orcs a bit differently. Here's the history in my campaign setting for them. Like, some players would enjoy that direction so that they could actually incorporate that into their character, right?
Yeah. If I can add kind of an example, In the High Rollers YouTube channel, they have a campaign called Erois, which is an excellent campaign. The Dungeon Master, Mark Hilms, he in the world of Erois, the orcs in that world aren't so much, the bloodthirsty, green-skinned orcs from Warcraft, right? Instead, they're still kind of green-skinned. They're large, but they're seafaring, and they're kind of these more like pirate-esque, orcish people, who are kind of beholden to the sea, and they're travelers and they're voyagers, which is kind of an interesting take on being an orc, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I actually, that reminded me, I at one point was listening to a podcast called Friends at the Table, and similar thing. The orcs were all librarians in kind of a secret society dealio, right? And I thought cool. That was a cool idea. But the main thing is that you're really going to want to know two things, I guess, if I were to boil it down. One, what role do you want as a DM what role do you want race to play in your campaign? Because if you're going to emphasize it, as in like conflicts between the race, or class struggles, or play into the stereotypes or break away from them in specific ways, then let your players know while they do their character creation. On the other hand, if you don't care too much and your players don't care too much, don't worry too much about this, right? It is still, in the end, fantasy. Just don't let any real racist stuff happen, because none of my friends have ever had it happen, but I've listened to enough stories on YouTube to know it can. So just make sure everyone feels comfortable at the table.
Agreed. Aside from choosing your race, number 2 is your class, and that may have the second most amount of impact on your character, and it's going to help you define your character and how they interact in combat and in non-combat situations, as well as how others interact with you. So, as a new player, choosing a class can be very confusing, because especially someone who's never played D&D, coming to a class, you might say, well, what's the difference between a fighter and a barbarian? And, as a DM, I like to ask my players questions like, how do you like to fight enemies? What would you like your character to be good at in and out of combat? Do you want to use magic? That one's a really, really good one, because sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And then the follow-up question to that is, how complex do you want your magic to be? And kind of a little aside here, you almost have to know your player a little bit. Like, I have a friend who is an excellent video gamer, right? And in our campaign, he has been playing a barbarian. And we recently switched out his barbarian for a new class, for a new character. He's a ranger now. And I could tell that was obviously the better choice, because he naturally has a mind for complicated gameplay. He's played lots of video games. He understands. And so seeing him just being a barbarian, raging and attacking, it's somewhat simplistic. So I could see that he was kind of stifled under not being able to do so much with magic and so forth. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I think that when it comes to helping your friends, your players choose classes, you kind of need to just be straight with them, because if they don't know, it's like, hey, if you're this type of warrior, without all these different feats that makes it more like different abilities and stuff that make it more interesting, then you're going to essentially be attacking a few times. It's great if you like just kind of overpowering and just kind of simple gameplay. If you want more complicated, go for the wizard. And just if you present it like that, I think some people can actually know enough about themselves to also be like, oh, I would like either something in the middle or something simple or complicated or whatever, right? A good point.
For sure. And you can actually even like hone it in a little bit more and, say like, are you okay with getting one attack during combat, or do you want more? Or, what video games do you like to play, if any? And how does your character regard deity? You can kind of, dig deeper. There are questions, though, that I think can waste some time. These are questions like, what do you want your character to be able to do? Because I found whenever I ask that question, they just say like, kill things, or what contributions do you see your character making? And that's just so general and vague that they're not really sure, especially a new player. So if they're new, I would kind of move towards binary questions. So like, would you rather be more stealthy or more defensive? Like have more armor, because those are natural opposites on a spectrum. You either are really stealthy or you generally have lots of armor. Obviously you can be in the middle, but kind of you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think that you'll really the good news about the class is that I think you'll mostly just have to explain it for the first time that a player is playing, because once they get into a campaign, they're going to learn pretty quick what the other players do, what, in their classes specifically, and then their own. And then from there, if they don't like their class, here's the great news. Like, they can always find either a story reason to switch. That's totally acceptable. Or, you just have their character leave and start a new one. But I think for players that have been playing for a bit, they'll honestly, they won't need the whole explanation about different classes, right?
For sure. The next portion is the abilities portion, and that's determining kind of your character's natural abilities as well as how your race and class, and honestly, I don't know if race is the right word, maybe species might be better, but how your race and class choices affect those abilities. And this is kind of, from a narrative sense, you could say it's kind of assessing your genetics and upbringing and how those affect your character. So simply put, if everything you do were split into 6 categories, how good would your character be in those 6 categories? And actually, that's essentially how D&D works. So I would actually use that to explain to someone who's playing D&D for the first time, say, hey, everything that you're going to do in this game is split into 6 categories: strength, dexterity, charisma, intelligence, wisdom, and constitution. And I can explain a little bit more about how to do that. But there are 3 methods to helping your players kind of determine those scores, and each has its pros and cons. There's point buy system, manual roll, and standard array. Most people end up picking the roll method, so that's just what I'm going to talk about here. That's where you get 4 d6s and then roll them, take the highest 3 numbers, add those together, write those down, and then do that 6 times. And then you assign each of those scores to the individual categories, and you're going to adjust those scores based on the advantages given in previous choices. Honestly, what I personally like to do is I actually like to roll these before doing anything else. Because, and maybe this might be a little bit more complicated for the new D&D player, but I like to roll these before doing anything else, because then at least you see what options you have available, and that can help you, because, I mean, we've talked about it before. Min-maxing has its place, but it shouldn't be placed in higher priority than the story. But you don't want a character that's just bad, right? So having those scores beforehand and being able to say, okay, I want this type of bonus from my race, this type of class, and these types of abilities or skills thanks to my class because of these scores that I'm choosing. That's kind of how I like to go about it. Any thoughts, Tanner?
Yeah, I think just really pointing out to your players the connection between the abilities and the skills will really add a lot to their experience, right? Because otherwise, I don't know about you, but like it always becomes a game of, okay, what's the main one I want? Cool, that's the highest one. And then what's the second one I want? Cool, maybe I've got a racial bonus or whatever that helps bump that up, so that's also high. And then the other ones are kind of like, whatever. But if it instead becomes like, hey, look at this close connection between the two. What of these skills do you want to do better? It becomes a little bit less ambiguous than just the abilities. So yeah, that's something that's helped me and help other players I know kind of get more meaning out of the ability scores beyond those first 2 categories, right?
Right. I also realized that, like, for a new D&D player, the character creation portion might not feel too much like D&D because you don't really roll dice except for this moment. So putting it at the beginning might be awesome just to help them feel like they're playing even a little bit, even though you haven't technically started playing yet. But also going back to, number 2, having them think about the answers to those questions you asked, like what does my player like to do for the group in when they're not in combat, or how does my player interact in combat? That can really help them understand, maybe I need more dexterity because they want to shoot bows and arrows and things like that, and help them kind of figure all that out. I would say in this step though, make sure you have lots of paper because you'll probably be writing lots of stuff down if you're not using D&D Beyond, which you probably should. But let's take a small break and actually go back to our first warm-up that we were talking about earlier. Tanner, we're going to come back to Troaxius. I want you to describe a situation in which the ideal of the character that you created is challenged in some way. The ideal that they want to create some sort of invention or machination that benefits the world. That ideal is challenged by the flaw, bond, or personality trait that you came up with.
So I'm going to say it's his bond. I'm going to go with his uncle. Now, while you might think that his uncle would be on board, his uncle actually was not someone who really wanted him to go crazy into artificing. He wanted him to stay home with his with Troaxius, his mother, to stay home and actually be there with the whole family, and actually help with just the local family business, right? And so then when Troaxius had this ideal of like, hey, I'm going to go out, I'm going to learn, I'm going to build this thing that's just amazing, he actually got a lot of pushback and kind of broke his uncle's heart to some extent, just being like, hey, you're meant to be here. And Troaxius was like, no, I'm meant to be out there doing something great. So kind of the classic thing where he's just going against his family's wishes to pursue his ideal, and that kind of breaks up that connection, right?
Wow. That's a really good scenario. And I think one of the reasons why that is so good is because you can easily, as a DM, involve that to create conflict. Whether it's Troaxius is writing letters home and getting no response, or they continually write letters to Troaxius saying, hey, you're never going to amount to anything, or however you want to take it. That's just a constant source for conflict to help cause the player through the character, or the character through the player, to make choices and to kind of change,
Yeah, exactly. I also like it because, honestly, any of those, I chose Bond because I found that was most interesting to me at the moment. But but there could be any, like the flaw, I could have found a way. In fact, I've thought about it since. There's a way to turn that into something that would conflict with his ideal. Same for personality trait. And I think that's where you get a lot of the character, kind of the dynamic character moments, is when you make sure to kind of pit those against each other as a DM, right? So, yeah, great point.
I love that. Well, moving on, number 4 in the character creation process is the description. This is really what informs the storytelling more than anything else, and I highly encourage you to encourage your players to really flesh out this section, because it helps not only the players themselves imagine, but also it helps their players help the other players imagine the character that they are playing, because you want everyone to be immersed. So I would encourage you to ask your character or your players questions like, instead of just saying, what does your face look like, ask questions like, what color are your eyes? How much do you smile? How big is your nose? How thick are your eyebrows? Wrinkles in your face or smooth skin? Piercings, scars, facial hair, severe cheekbones or kind of baby-faced? You can ask all sorts of these questions. You can go on. And honestly, it can get tedious. So what I would say is, pick the most prominent features. And imagine you're kind of describing a character to a suspect sketch artist, like at a police station. You need to be able to identify them from a crowd, so you're going to pick out the things that are identifiable, the things that kind of stand out. But moving on, going from just simple physical description, you want to describe their nature and their history. And actually, that's kind of why we were talking about in the warm-up and the break today. We were talking about ideals, bonds, flaws, and personality traits. And this is kind of how I would describe each to a player. For a personality trait, I would say if you were going to hang out with your character for a week, what one thing would you say about them that kind of sticks out just while you're hanging out, chilling in your house with them? And then about your flaw, I would explain this, and I would say if you are your character's roommate, what annoying thing do they do that just annoys you the most about them? And then their ideal is if you had to summarize this character, what basic life guiding principle would you ascribe to them, or kind of what's their aspiration? And their bond is naturally, if this character were wanting to settle down anywhere, what force would pull them or stop them from doing that? So if they were going to go somewhere else or a specific location, what would essentially stop them from doing that or pull them in another direction? And obviously those aren't perfect, but hopefully that helps you narrow it down into the right ballpark. But I'd say having those are incredibly important because, more than anything, they help you create, like I said, conflict. They help your players put themselves in situations in which story can naturally happen because they're character-driven. Anything you want to add, Tanner?
Yeah, I think that's great. Like, especially, I think both aspects are so important. Not the physical and kind of getting nitty-gritty with that. Can help them visualize this person as an actual character. And the reason why I think that's important is because I think most people will go towards a couple specific places when they start with character creation. They'll probably think about maybe not all of the aspects of the characters, like the ideals, bonds, flaws, personality traits. They might not think about all of them, but they'll probably think about a few things, right? That's probably going to be the key of their character next to their class is like, okay, he's going to be this kind of annoying, or he's going to have this kind of like personality trait. Especially if if you have a player that's very charismatic or creative, they might think of any number of those things. But then it's just kind of an amorphous character that is like one personality trait, and it gets a little bland.
Yeah.
And so making them go through the occasionally rote step of like actually describing everything about how they look, I think that really helps them look beyond making a flat 2D character that doesn't have too much depth or past or history, right?
For sure. And actually, speaking of history, this is also the step in which you help your player pick their background. And I used to kind of just give a full list of backgrounds, and you can honestly do that for players who are more experienced, but for noobs, what I would recommend is just saying, how did your character grow up? And then have them kind of start going through that story, and if they haven't figured it out, just kind of say like, well, where are your character's parents right now? And that should hopefully help them figure out, well, they don't know their parents, or they do know their parents and they lived in this town. And from there, you can kind of extrapolate their background and then give them a few options. Some people choose backgrounds based on what perks it gives you, but I generally encourage my players to pick their backgrounds based on the narrative backgrounds, just because I feel like that makes the most sense. But after that, you move, unless you want to add anything else, Tanner.
No, yeah, I would just add that if people are having a hard time choosing a history for their character, kind of really delve into the bond section and just be like, hey, what kind of allies or people do you know throughout the world, that for good and bad, and have them just kind of come up with a few. It could be 3, could be 4. Yeah. Maybe like, okay, do they have a personal nemesis? And we're not talking like, oh, burned your family down or anything like, but just like, was there someone that you kind of had a grudge with when you're younger? Do you have someone that, just like a business friend that you would buy stuff from? Like, doing all this helps your player realize like, okay, they've been places before. They can expect to go places going forward and meet these people. and they need something to talk about, so I've got to actually work out this whole history thing, right?
Awesome. I love that. I'd never really thought about like digging into the bond. I think that's a really excellent piece of advice. And the last piece of creating your character is equipping them. So Tanner, walk us through that.
Yeah, so if you're, like we said at the start, this is kind of aimed at starting players. And there's a couple things to keep in mind. Typically with equipping your characters, there's going to be one of two ways to do it. One, and this is very popular, you have starter gear, kind of just built in with your class, your race, just dependent on the choices you've chosen before this. There's certain things that you have options to choose, right? And you can find lists for those, but they'll typically have like a weapon, some armor, some various like kits and things like that. And you can and it kind of just makes you choose like tool sets and stuff like that. Just kind of rounds you out as a character. Is not going to give you like anything crazy out of the ordinary, but is going to get the job done. And personally, I'd recommend that for new players. Because the other option is where you kind of just have starting gold, and that's dependent by class, right? For example, the artificer, like Troaxiaus. Like the artificer starts with 5d4 times 10 gold pieces. That's kind of like their start. And so that you could have more or less depending on how you roll. And then if you choose to equip yourself with that method, you kind of just go down the list, and like just buy whatever with the amount of gold you have. And there's some that works well for someone who's more experienced, maybe has some specific ideas. But for a new player, I don't recommend that at all. They'll see a huge list, they won't think about certain things, and then they'll just kind of feel a little bit lost, I don't know. What do you think, Justin?
I think you're exactly right. I mean, it also depends on your skill as a dungeon master, and how detailed you are about equipment, because I've played with dungeon masters who don't really give a rip about what's in an explorer's pack. They don't really care about certain sundry items too much. So if you're able to really be so detailed oriented that you can be like, oh, you didn't buy that, you don't have it, then yeah, I'd say definitely go with that. And if your players can also be that way. But doing the standard equipment is just plain easy. And if you're level 1, then if you don't have that equipment, then I would say you're technically level 0, because what's a paladin without their shield and sword, or a barbarian without their great axe,
Yeah, and a couple things I want to just harp on here with equipment. One, there will be some players who will want to do the starting gold thing, and they'll want to just get a very, maybe not even starting gold. Like, regardless of the typical equipment, they'll be like, hey, could I have this one really cool item? And my character just has it, and especially at level 1, that's not great. Now, as levels continue, right, and as players come in mid campaign, that's more likely to happen, right? They're not going to have just the starting equipment, and that's totally fine. But at the start of the campaign, if you have any players being like, hey, I want, the Vorpal blade, like right out of the get-go, and I'm going to say right now, you're going to, while it might seem like you're going to bum them out by saying no, like, think about it. One of the best things about this game is beating a dungeon or an enemy or, doing whatever and then getting equipment. If they already have the best sword they're going to get, they're not going to care. They're not going to care about all those, about a huge portion of the game, which is that kind of random finding of things that's coming up for them. So you really need to think about the progression and their enjoyment in the campaign, and don't just roll over because they really want that super cool item. There's a reason why most DMs, and honestly, the manual suggests this as well. If a player is going to have something in addition to the starting equipment, typically it's going to be like one personal item that doesn't have a mechanical benefit at all. It's just something to do with their character. So with your players, really let them know it's like, hey, at the start of the campaign, I'm not going to let you just kind of choose whatever, unless of course they're more experienced and they're not going crazy, obviously, and they do the gold buy system. But just let them know and be like, hey, I'll give you some good stuff later. You just gotta trust me, right?
And I can even see that, you can give your players like some sort of magical item, just as long as it has very specific use cases and it's not overpowered. Like, in Critical Role Campaign 2, you see the Wand of Smiles or whatever. That's a very specific use case. You're not going to see that very often used, where it just makes people smile for no reason. Yep. I don't know how you could use that too often for some sort of advantage, but I would be okay giving my players like one of those each, just to give them a little spice, but just as long as it doesn't break the game.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there was something I wanted. Yeah, so another thing, and you kind of brought this up earlier, there's some DMs who frankly don't talk about, okay, did you pull out a torch? Okay, mark that, thing. Or like, oh, do you have 50 foot of rope to tie that person up with? They don't.
My favorite is crossbow bolts.
Yeah, do you have the crossbow bolts? Do you have, okay, you guys have been traveling all day to the location. Do you have, some rations? Like, they don't play like that. And if that's the kind of game you want, then that's fine. In that case, maybe you just assume they started with starter equipment, or not, and you're like, I'm just gonna kind of hand wave that stuff. I don't need to check if they have a bedroll,
Right.
Now, I'm gonna encourage some people, even if your typical campaign isn't like that, try shaking it up. Like maybe not for the whole campaign. Maybe if you do a one shot or a specific section, or like kind of arc of your campaign, consider, doing that and actually like really accounting for their provisions. Because I think that players would also get a kick out of that as well. So long as it's not, they might enjoy it for a stretch of time. If it looks like they're getting annoyed, move past it. But I think it's a good way to change things up if you haven't been accounting for equipment already.
Agreed. Just hearing you talk about that made me think of a few different scenarios that I want to try, and kind of got me excited for starting new campaigns. But what are you gonna do? Well, there you have it, listener. We went through the character creation process and hopefully helped you figure out how to work through the process with someone who's never done it before, in such a way that they're excited to play, they're not bored, and they really, like Tanner said, they've opened up their creativity and imagination and thought of something new and that excites them. So thank you for joining us again here at the Tavern. We're always happy to come here and have these conversations. And like I said, if you're wanting to have these conversations with us and actually be, here live, not in person, but be online live while we are talking and participate that way, let us know. Again, thank you so much for all the support. It's really cool to see things growing week after week, and just being able to give you guys more help and hopefully better content. If you guys have any pointers on what we should say or what we shouldn't say, again, reach out to us. Tanner, any final parting words for our listener?
Honestly, you guys are going to do great. You're going to make so many wonderful characters. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. And we'll be back. We'll be back next week with another great episode of How to Be a Better DM. Until then, my friend, let's go ahead and roll initiative. Thank you for listening to today's show. We really appreciate your support and your patronage. We have a few more announcements to go over. First,
did you ever fall in love with the library as a kid? It was a place where you could experience 1,000 stories, without having to buy 1,000 books. That is what Monsters.rent can do for your D&D campaign. You can rent and swap out as many quality miniature monsters and creatures for your D&D party as you could ever want, without having to buy them. You can rescue villagers from a kobold camp, or lead your party through the fighting forest, or many more adventures. We're coming out with new bundles all the time. Just sign up for our subscription to get access to your own personal library of minis. Go to monsters.rent to find out more. That's the website. monsters.rent. Get your library pass to a world of minis today.
We also wanted to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by Stardust and Dragons. I'm going to let one of the cast of Stardust and Dragons, Christian Hatcher, and his crew tell you a little bit more about it.
This August, a new adventure podcast is coming to a platform near you, filled with action,
You one of the two of them. We can't keep taking hits like that.
drama,
Everything that she's been doing, everything she's going to do, finally sets in.
and stardust.
Help! Help! Someone, please!
Find out more about this epic odyssey at stardustanddragons.com, where adventure awaits in the stars.
That's all the announcements we have today. Again, thank you so much for everything you do for us. You make this show possible. Like we said before, we'll be back next week with another great episode, and until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative.